Remember first to possess his books, for without them he's but a sot, as I am, nor hath not one spirit to command. So says Caliban in Shakespeare's Tempest. He is referring to his master, his Apollonian master, a scientist, a sorcerer, but in fact a man of books, a man whose magic is, and indeed his authority is, in his books. You get rid of the books, the words, and you see an idiot as everybody else. So assumes, anyway, Caliban, who is a very gullible savage. Now, what does this have to do with the problem of biology? We have come to assume that biology is a perfectly legitimate, meaningful discipline. We know nothing about the ancient world where biology was, well, a meaningless, impossible discipline. We have learned in some cases about Aristotle as being the father of biology. On the other hand, we have probably not heard that Aristotle considered biology ultimately a failed enterprise. We are likely to have heard of the etymology of the term biology, the study of life, bios, logia, a discourse, a talk, a reasoning about life. But of course, biology is understood here as a modern science, which is to say, scientia, knowledge of life. Knowledge of life that assumes, well, a special role in our life. Why biology? What is the whole point of biology? Well, biology is presumably to tell us something about life. What is it to tell us about life? Of course, biology will measure. Of course, it will try to implement a so-called scientific method, the modern scientific method. It will calculate, use perhaps modern mathematics. It will classify, even digitize. But what is the whole point? What is it trying to get at? And this question is of utmost importance if we are to understand what biology is. Where is it going? What is the point of it? Well, the study of life. Yes, but what does it mean by life? What does it mean by life? Well, it doesn't know. Well, it's got to have some idea, and then to identify its target. And then he can go into details. But how does it identify its target? What does it mean by life? Well, whatever biology in modern scientia, which originally was called natural philosophy, the early modern scientists spoke of themselves as natural philosophers of nature conceived in modern terms, which turn out to be mechanistic, strictly mechanistic terms. Well, what is biology all about? we could go and look at the ancients and say, well, what is that? What is biology supposed to be for Aristotle? And why would Aristotle ultimately consider biology bankrupt, an impossibility? How can you not study life? Well, of course, on some level, everybody can study life, but in other words, study. Make an effort to understand life. But what is it about biology that distinguishes it from other manners of approaching life? Could we not say that painters study life? Could we not say that musicians, composers study life? What is it about life as studied by biology that distinguishes itself from other conceptions of life, or life as conceived by other disciplines? In what way does biology consider life? What for? This is the key question. Where is it going? Why does it approach life? Why does it study life? Does it study life to paint a picture? No. Does it study life to produce a beautiful musical composition? No. So what is it trying to achieve? We could go to the ancients again and say, well, what would Aristotle be trying to achieve in the study of life that is called biology? And then again, what does modern man try to achieve by it? It is probably best to begin with Aristotle. What does Aristotle try to achieve with biology? Well, the problem can be stated in plain terms, somewhat formalistic terms. Nevertheless, it's not difficult to understand. Before biology, we have two problems. We have the political, ethical problem of man, right? Now so it is the problem of ethics. What is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil? Then we have, of course, the problem of, well, we could call it metaphysics or theology, which is to say, the problem of foundations of ethics. So we have these two realms. We could say the realm of men and the realm of gods. What is human and what is above the human. And there's, of course, a tension between these two. Now, one could attempt to solve that tension. But how? By measuring, so to speak, the distance that separates the human from the divine. How do you do that? Well, you could try to fully account for the emergence of the human out of the subhuman. You could try to measure the distance that separates subhuman forms of life from the human form of life. Now, if you can do that, then you can essentially account for the human. Is this what Aristotle is trying to do and fails to do and acknowledges to have failed to do? Almost. Aristotle does not, by any means, deny that there is a hierarchy involving the divine and the human being on the bottom. When he sets out and fails to measure the distance between the subhuman and the human, he is not trying to recreate life a la Dr. Frankenstein. He is trying to show that the metaphysical is at work in the physical, and that therefore the human life is providentially sustained, that the divine is at work in not only in the human but also in the subhuman. So there is a kind of animism involved here. Can that presence be measured? This would entail, to some extent, a kind of proof that the human is grounded in the divine, fundamentally. But that proof would entail access to, or even revelation of, the divine. You can have signs of the divine, but you cannot measure those signs so that you could call them proofs. So every time you have signs, these signs fade away. This is the idea. And this is why biology, as the attempt to measure the distance between the subhuman and the human, fails. It fails because the divine is indeterminate. It cannot be measured. Now, with modernity, we are no longer seeking, as biologists, to measure or to prove, shall we say, the presence of the divine in the constitution of the human. What we're trying to do is prove that there is no such presence. So we have a mechanistic conception of the human, a mechanistic conception of life. And so we ask questions such as, well, where does life begin? In the case of current controversies over birth, even abortion, you say, well, where does life begin? Does it begin in the womb? Does it begin at what stage when the baby comes out? Somehow when the heart starts beating? No, when he starts breathing outside of the womb. These are all technical questions. Conception, at what precise moment, pray, what is the precise moment in which somehow magically life begins? There is a verse in the first canto of Dante's Inferno where Dante says, that he cannot well retell at what point he entered into his dream. What he's referring to is a point of determination of the human. So at what point do we enter into this world, this life that is a kind of dream? At what point does the divine become finite, human? And he says, I cannot well retell, because more than the good is involved. There is an element of darkness there. So if you are to retell by what point now we enter into this world, of course that presupposes that there is a pre-existence of the human as something divine. Then you have to consider evil too. And so at the end of the Inferno, Dante goes through, indeed, back through, so to speak, to come back out into the open. He goes through Beelzebub, Satan. So there's an ugly aspect to this. There is a fall in biblical terms. How do we end up in our current situation? Well, there's been a fall. And how do you account for that fall? It's hard to do. It's hard to do. You have to face the problem of evil. So there is no scientific knowledge that will, Apollonian scientific knowledge that will settle the matter. So in modern biology, you do not try to prove that God is at work in the emerging of man out of the subhuman. You try to say that, well, there is a kind of mechanism at work. Again, the primal mover is not the love of God, but it is the love of survival, or rather the thirst, the hunger for power. Now, that means that there are mechanisms, and if we study these mechanisms, we can account for the distance between the subhuman and the human. And if we can, we no longer need to appeal to the ideal, the divine, as empty, formal, human construct, a dream of what is above man. We can construct what is above man, what is beyond man. We can enter into, in fact, we can bring about the dawn of a transhuman age in which we build, we construct, we create what is above man, since we have mastered what is beneath man, mastery of nature. So this is the idea here with modern biology. Why would modern biology be bankrupt? Well, it presumes that that life, human life, emerges mechanically from its absence, from non-human life, in fact, from non-life. And the notion here, the notion of life here is quite vague, but we could say that biologists will think in terms of consciousness, loosely understood. Biological mechanisms are, after all, as such, chemical mechanisms. What distinguishes life is not simply blood flowing and the likes and breathing. I mean, these are very vaporous parameters. What justifies them as opposed to other parameters? What is crucial is the emergence of consciousness. And of course, this comes out in the current contemporary debates on ideology. So whenever you have the sense of self, whenever you have the sense of self, the me, myself, and I, then you start having real life. We're really alive. We feel alive. The feelings and the consciousness of those feelings, most importantly. For even an amoeba might have feelings, a sense, an electrical impulse, but it does not carry this weight of consciousness. Consciousness, what in the world is that? Of course, we have artificial intelligence projects, the attempt to construct consciousness mechanistically, right? Well, this sense of certainty, this consciousness of this self, me, myself, and I, this seems to define life to the greatest extent in modern biology and in modern discourse in general. What is truly alive is someone who, well, is aware. But what is this awareness? Is aware of suffering, aware of feeling. What is this awareness all about? What is suffering all about? Pain. Does a stone feel pain? Feeling tied to a sense of self. Does a stone seek to survive? Do we seek to survive? There is a whole area of gray area, an area of ambiguities, conceptual ambiguities in modern discourse and in modern biology specifically. But here the question ultimately is for modern biology, that of, again, measuring the distance that separates the subhuman, so let us say, even stones, water, from the human. How do you do that? Well, by going into the subhuman forms of life, pre-human, monkeys, birds, amoebas, everything that is between what is seen as mere matter and human consciousness. So there's a whole range, a spectrum of forms of entities, forms of life, we say, but in fact of beings that are somehow somewhere between the stone and the human consciousness. So the human form of life, other forms of life. If we can account for these forms of life, for example, in terms of DNA sequences, we can then understand the human fully, understand where the human is coming from. We can control, therefore, the human's destiny. We can shape the human's destiny. We can create our future. We have the DNA sequences. We can play Dr. Frankenstein to the utmost. Right. Well, at what point should we begin in biology? From stones again? There is no sign of human life in stones. All right. Nothing in stones reminds us of human life, shall we say. Possible, and yet for a child, just about anything can remind us of human life. A cloud can remind us of human shape. A stone itself falls, and we say, he looks like a pear, or he fell like a pear, or uh, he's as hard as a rock. And we see in the rock certain anthropomorphic qualities. So now, in terms of early antiquity, let us speak in there's this modern term animism. We have a sense that everything is somehow pregnant with life. Stones are, the stars are alive. Uh, they're beings, they're living beings. What does this mean? It means that life is divine and that it manifests itself in various forms. Well, this means, of course, that no mechanism can account for the emergence of life. Life does not emerge from what is dead, but what is eminently alive, namely what is eternally alive, the divine life. Now, if biology in the ancient world was not possible for the reasons that were noted just a while ago, modern biology is even more impossible insofar as it is also absurd. Why is it absurd? Well, it takes for granted a very ambiguous, gray sense of what is not life. Not only does it try to reduce life to a mechanism, but where does it begin from? Say, well, it begins from the amoeba, say. But the amoeba is a gray area again. Electrical stimuli. Then it tries to reach all the way up to human consciousness, to measure that distance. There is a radical reductionism here, of course. What is life? For the ancients, well, ultimately, being something divine, it is something cognitive. There is thought. The more thought, the more life. God is eminently alive. We are not always eminently alive. We're close to being eminently alive to the extent that we align with the divine. We fall into oblivion to the extent that we turn away from the divine, from thought, pure thought. We fall into a dream world. So, what is alive for the modern biologist? This is a big problem. This is a big problem. And of course, public debates surround this, whether they focus on the problem of abortion or of genetic manipulation and eugenics. This is anthropology. This is a big problem. What is life for modern biology? It's supposed to be, after all, a study of life. How does it point to that area that it's studying? Well, again, this ambiguity. Where do we begin from? Where do we end? We don't really end in the human because the human is supposed to be carried further into the artificial, what the life form that the human creates. So it goes to the superhuman, but it's not quite divine, of course, not in classical terms. And it starts from a very primitive, shall we say, sense of the human in entities such as an amoeba there. Biology doesn't really study stones. We see this, but it wants more. It seeks more. What about stones, though? Could we not say that the amoeba arises from a modification of electrical impulses, and these are molecules that arise from atoms, and it's all about the stardust ultimately. And so biology is a bit shaky there. It must rely on chemistry and let chemistry have its own space. Chemistry will deal with that aspect of reality, of tangible reality. The merely inert, or in fact, that is very tricky as well. How can an atom be seen as simply inert? It's responsive, So something that is less, we have to speak in terms of degrees here, less responsive to the human, less of a mirror of the human. Well, can we account for the human in mechanistic terms? Oh, well, the classics already tell us that even in the 18th century that is a joke, that that attempt amounts to simply one of an exercise in obscuring the human, obscuring the whole valence, the whole significance of human life. We're no longer seeing the human as the human sees itself. We're no longer understanding human reality. We're simply reducing it to something that is, well, a machine. And then we want to recreate it on the basis of that machine and go beyond it, because we can't precisely have the human as such, the old human. We have to create a superhuman cyborg. And we'll say, oh, look at the advantages of the new one with respect to the old one. The new one can count more speedily. He can compute more readily. He can maybe even run faster. He can jump higher, and so forth and so on. We can obscure the human, of course. So biology contributes to this obscurantism that we witness today. It contributes substantively by promoting this notion of human life as being mechanically derived out of the absence of life, out of the absence of consciousness. So ultimately, this stone, it's easy to understand the stone is strictly mechanistic terms. It's harder to understand the human alone in mechanistic terms, obviously, or even the monkey. You can't do it unless you measure this distance, this gap between the stone and. So the stone, we're pretty confident about the stone. But even then, chemistry raises issues about the atom and the subatomic and the quantum doctrines, and there's a lot of instability. There are a lot of variables, and ultimately we're in the dark. So we can play pragmatists. We can pretend that as long as our experiments work more or less, we can also reduce the parameters, narrow them down. We can lower the standards, narrow our vision so that more or less our experiments work. We can claim that they're successful. We can leave the variables out, and restrict the field of our competence and of our claims to the point where, well, we no longer have any trace of life left. Complicated situations with chemistry, even more complicated with biology. We can rely on the machine ultimately, and we can try to produce machines that create new machines and obscure the questions that are presupposed by our answers and our attempt to build answers, to create answers, to produce them, and produce, in fact, a tower, even a Tower of Babel, made of answers that obscure the questions. So there you have it. Some considerations on the bankruptcy of biology. Should we trust biology? Should we listen to biologists? What are biologists trying to do? What are they trying to achieve? What is their goal? What is their aim? Yeah? And much of the validity of whatever they say is dependent upon this problem of ends. What are they trying to achieve? And it turns out, again, that they're trying to get rid of the divine, keep the divine out of the equation, and assume that the human comes from the subhuman. So if you can master the gap between the subhuman and the human, mechanistically, because there is no divine providence, then you can establish the superhuman. Right? This is the transhumanist project. And, those who adhere to it will trust the biologists. Those who don't have a good reason not to.